Imagine yourself in this worst-case scenario. You've set sail on a voyage to discover a thoroughfare in the north of Canada that may take you all the way to East Asia from your home of Britain. You're equipped with the finest technology the British Empire of 1845 can produce. You've been aboard the Erebus or the Terror, ships that both may be older than you as a crewman, for 2 years. And you're having to come to terms with the fact that you may have to abandon ship and venture into the flat, featureless ice to an unknown fate. Today we're going to be talking about Franklin's Lost Expedition. We'll go over what happened, why it happened, how it's actually changed the world, and how it's become such a fascinating historical tale of discovery and disaster. Part 1. Preparations. So let's put ourselves in the place of those who planned this voyage. It's the mid-1840s, and at this point most of the world has been mapped out. The British Empire is at its peak with territories spanning the globe. However, since the days of Christopher Columbus himself, an obstacle to global trade has remained. Europe had no good way to trade with the powers of East Asia, China in particular. Sure, overland travel existed, but risked attack and tariffs from the dozens of empires such a journey would span. If the British could find a sea route to Asia that didn't involve going all the way around Africa or all the way around South America, they'd have a monopoly on trade with China. Something to keep in mind about these kinds of explorers is best summarized by the producer of the AMC show The Terror, Sue Hugh, when she said that they were like the astronauts of their age, both in terms of how they might have felt going into such unknown territories, but also as far as the prestige with which they were viewed goes. Finding what the British Admiralty called the Northwest Passage is the backdrop and motive for this soon-to-be doomed expedition. A certain Sir John Barrow was responsible for organizing this journey. Several had tried to find this almost mythical passage before, but to no avail. They thought they were close, however, and so Barrow went about choosing a leader for this new voyage. His first pick, William Edward Parry, was tired of the Arctic and so declined the offer to lead. His second, James Clark Ross, had promised his wife he wouldn't go to the Arctic, a promise he was probably glad he made later. His third, James Fitzjames, was too young but would end up a part of the expedition anyway. And then Francis Crozier was an Irishman who would end up as captain of the Terror, but he also declined command of the overall expedition, or may have been passed over due to being Irish. In the end, it was one Sir John Franklin at 59 years old who was chosen for the job. The ships they were to sail on were both a little old. The Erebus, which had a name that literally just means darkness in Greek, had been built in 1826, making it 19, and the Terror had been built in 1813, which kind of unintuitively meant that it actually participated in the War of 1812 and was present during the Battle of Baltimore, the events of which went on to inspire the national anthem of the United States, which is just a very strange point of connection. Despite the age of these ships, both were heavily upgraded to say the least. Both vessels were equipped with steam engines procured from converted train engines, which personally I think might have been a bit of a red flag, but what do I know? From my understanding, these weren't to be used constantly. The ships would mostly be wind-powered through the sails, and they only carried about 12 days worth of coal for the purpose of steam operation. The Terror alone was also stocked with 2 tons of tobacco, because everybody smoked like a chimney back then, 8,000 tins of preserved food, and 7,560 liters of liquor, because why not drink on your deadly voyage into a frozen hellscape? Something has to take the edge off, I guess. The Terror also held a library of 1,200 books, and the ships even had heating systems which were connected to the stoves. Considering what period of time we're in right here, these are some downright luxurious conditions. You might think that an expedition with 2 ships named essentially Darkness and Terror might be one you'd want to skip, but they certainly did not come unprepared. As for those embarking, there were 24 officers and 110 other crewmen total. Most of them were English, but there were also Irishmen, Welsh, and Scots among the crew, alongside a singular Norwegian and a singular Canadian. Of the crew, only 6 had any experience with the Arctic, including Franklin himself, Captain Crozier, First Lieutenant Graham Gore, Assistant Surgeon Alexander McDonald, and the two ice masters, which is a baller title, James Reed of the Erebus and Thomas Blanky of the Terror. From what I can tell, out of the six, Crozier was not only the most experienced with the Arctic, but also probably the most competent of the group, just generally. I said in my most recent video on colonization and undiscovered lands that canned food lined with lead was a large part of the reason the expedition would fail, but upon conducting the further research needed for this video, it's actually way more complicated than that and much more tragic in a way. As you'll come to see, I really think they prepared almost as well as they could, maybe save for a lack of experience amongst the crewmen, and yet their best just wasn't enough for the frozen horror that awaited them. Part 2. The Expedition. The Erebus and the Terror set sail on the 19th of May, 1845. They stopped for fresh water in Scotland before stopping in Greenland after about 30 days of travel. On the west coast of Greenland, they received a shipment of meat from the Barretto Jr., and the crewmen sent letters home, the last memorabilia most of their families would ever receive. A few notable things about this point in the expedition is that Franklin had actually apparently banned swearing and being drunk, which is almost comically stuck-up British officer, and 5 men were sent home due to sickness. I've got to say, those are probably 5 of the luckiest guys to have ever lived. Imagine having a sick day in the 1800s no less, and finding out you got the better end of the deal because everyone you were just sailing with entirely disappears. The fever wouldn't seem so bad after that. However, Greenland wouldn't be the last place that these 120-odd men would be seen by European eyes. That would be all the way in Baffin Bay, which itself was named for a previous Arctic explorer, where they were waiting for better conditions to go further. The whaling ships Prince of Wales, commanded by one Captain Dannett, and the Enterprise, captained by Robert Martin, made note of them at this time in July 1845. This is the last time they were ever recorded in text by outsiders. Note my very specific phrasing, as it will be important later. From this point forward, everything I tell you is the compilation of over 150 years of notes, oral histories, and discoveries from others, as well as the words of the lost crew themselves. So from this point, I think we'll start with the one piece of textual evidence we still have from the crew, which, in a way, you could think of as their collective last words. I will read them verbatim. HMS ships Erebus and Terror wintered in the ice in latitude 70.05 north, longitude 98.23 west. Having wintered in 1846-7 at Beechey Island in latitude 74.43.28 north, long 91.39.15 west, after having ascended Wellington Channel to latitude 77 and returned by the west side of Cornwallis Island. Sir John Franklin commanding the expedition, all well. Party consisting of 2 officers and 6 men left the ships on Monday 24th May 1847. Signed G. M. Gore, Lieutenant. Signed Chas F. Devoe, Mate. This is the first part of what is known as the Victory Point Note, which was placed in a cairn on the northwest coast of King William Island, near where it is presumed the Erebus and the Terror became permanently trapped in the ice. There is a near identical copy to this note that was found a few miles to the southwest, but in this Victory Point Note there is a second part written a year later which indicated that things had began to go quite south. So here is the second part. 25th of April, 1848. HM ships Terror and Erebus were deserted on the 22nd of April, 5 leagues north-northwest of this, having been beset since 12th September 1846. The officers and crews, consisting of 105 souls under the command of Captain F.R. M. Crozier, landed here in latitude 69 degrees 37'42", more degree stuff. This paper was found by Lieutenant Irving under the cairn supposed to have been built by Sir James Ross in 1831, 4 miles to the northward, where it had been deposited by the late Commander Gore in May-June 1847. Sir James Ross's pillar has not been found, and the paper has been transferred to this position, which is that in which Sir J. Ross's pillar was erected. Sir John Franklin died on the 11th of June, 1847, and the total loss by deaths in the expedition has been to this date 9 officers and 15 men. Signed James Fitzjames, Captain HMS Erebus. Signed F.R.M. Crozier, captain and senior officer, and start on tomorrow 26th for Backsfish River. These are presumed to have been written before the abandonment of the ships, but not by much, and they were both probably written by James Fitzjames, a senior officer on the Erebus who was one of the candidates for command from earlier. Beyond that point, all we know for sure is that the remaining crew members set out south in the hopes of making it into Canada and rediscovering Western civilization. On this journey, everyone still alive eventually succumbed. This ends all we know from the original expedition. Now we move on to Part 3, the rescue attempt. So, after about 2 years of silence from the expedition, a certain Jane Lady Franklin, wife of Sir John Franklin, began to grow concerned about the lack of news. Of course, by our modern standard, not hearing from someone in 2 years is pretty unthinkable, but even from a time of slower travel and transfer of information, 2 years of absolutely nothing is a bit of a cause for concern. It evidently took some doing, but eventually the Admiralty sent out expeditions with the goal of finding the lost Franklin expedition's crew. They even offered a bounty of £20,000 to any party or parties of any country who shall render assistance to the crews of the Discovery ships under the command of Sir John Franklin. Unfortunately, by the time this was all happening, even by the time Franklin's wife had grown concerned, he was already dead. The only thing more doomed than the expedition itself was any attempt to rescue them. It's here I'll make a little emphasis about how bad the terrain was. The AMC series The Terror, an excellent show based on this event and my introduction to it, does a great job of showing the absolute desolation of this environment. Nothing but iced oceans for countless miles, lasting years, trapping what you think is the pinnacle of human innovation and making it powerless. Even when you make landfall, the land is empty and gray and lacking in all sustenance, at least that you're aware of, and those who can live in this area, the Inuit, have years of experience surviving the terrain, and you don't. Over a dozen ships, mostly British but a few American, set out to locate Franklin and his men. They came up short, but did find some relics from the expedition. One of the most tragic things is that a certain Robert Goodsir, a surgeon on the brig Lady Franklin, was part of the rescue effort. Not only was he a part of it, but he personally volunteered and wrote to Franklin's wife to join the effort. Little did he know at the time, but his own brother, Harry Goodsir, who was on the expedition, was already dead or dying. I cannot imagine what he must have felt upon finding the graves of several of the expedition's men in 1850. Another expedition, led by Edward Belcher, almost went worse, with 4 of his 5 ships having to be abandoned, and as we now know, the voyage was hopeless anyway. It is believed only a handful of crew members were still alive by the time that this expedition set out in 1852. One of the ships, though, that embarked and was abandoned, the Resolute, would actually be scavenged, and timbers from it would be made into the Resolute desk, which has been a desk used in the Oval Office by many presidents, which is another just really weird connection to U.S. governmental stuff, I guess. Rescue attempts overland resulted in encounters with the Inuit people, who told Western explorers of the lost crew. Tales of starvation, cannibalism, and death, which they backed up with relics from the expedition on their persons, such as silverware. And what of Sir John Franklin's poor wife? Well, though the Admiralty labeled the expedition lost at the end of March in 1854, she commissioned her very own expedition aboard the steam schooner Fox, which did make a discovery, the Victory Point note I just read you. Though it's definitely not what she wanted, I hope it at least offered her some closure, and if it wasn't for her, nobody alive at that time would have found out anything at all. But I mean, really, I just can't imagine the anguish of knowing your spouse was lost out in a barren tundra, with all efforts to find them failing, and eventually those who were helping you just kind of giving up. I mean, call it stubborn, call it refusing to see the writing on the wall, but I think Jane Lady Franklin deserves a lot of credit for her devotion and her dedication. And while this is all exceedingly tragic, I do think there is actually something beautiful in these people that love their family and their spouses so much that they quite literally went to the ends of the earth to try and recover them. Part 4. What went wrong? This is a question that people have been asking ever since the original disappearance, as you might expect. The ships were advanced, well-stocked, and despite some of the crew being inexperienced, the leadership itself was pretty well proven. The go-to answer for decades has been the lead lining in the tinned food, causing an array of physical and mental problems amongst the crew, leading to poor decision-making, sickness, and ultimately the disaster that resulted in their deaths. However, recent findings have indicated otherwise. For one, it may not have even been the food acting as a source of lead poisoning, but actually the water system. The steam engines required fresh water to run, and so they were equipped with tools to desalinate the ocean water, which that process may have contaminated the water with lead, and since that water was also used for drinking, it's easy to see how that could have been a cause for problems. In addition, lead-lined food was used basically everywhere else in the British Navy, and lead poisoning, probably did exist, but it wasn't necessarily extremely common in other ships. The cans being poorly made, however, may have been a cause for some of it rotting, which certainly wouldn't have helped, and we do have evidence of pretty much the lowest bidder being the choice for the provider of the canned food, which, if I were a crewman on the ship, I would not have wanted to know that. However, another problem may have actually arisen unrelated to lead at all. According to Alexandra Witz's 2016 Nature.com article, Fingernail Absolves Lead Poisoning and Death of Arctic Explorer, scientists have now discovered that one of the few sailors whose bodies have been found had a zinc deficiency, and suggest that it was this, not lead exposure, that led to his death. Jenny Christensen of, I'm sorry if I say this wrong, Trick Analytics in North Saanich, Canada, used a synchrotron particle accelerator in Saskatoon, what a lot of strange words in a row, to establish that crewman John Hartnell suffered from a severe zinc deficiency, which would have suppressed his immune system. According to Witza, the researchers proposed that this made him more vulnerable to tuberculosis and pneumonia, diseases that are thought to have ultimately killed him. This, alongside your almost standard litany of frostbite, scurvy, pot disease, and all of the rest, were likely the main factors of the various crewmen's deaths. These findings suggest to me that more than anything, the Franklin expedition was doomed simply because of the horrible circumstances they were in, compounding upon one another. There's no simple, oh, they were doomed, they ate lead-lined food, as the same study I just read you indicated that the lead levels in the crew members weren't actually that notable. Instead, they were basically just unlucky and out of their depth. Bad conditions set in at the wrong time, and many of them weren't prepared for the conditions. They got stuck, and they suffered, struggled, and eventually perished. I was, however, slightly premature in ending the last section where I did, because there's one last thread to follow before we move on to the discovery of the remains of the expedition. You see, Inuit rumors indicated that between 1852 and 1858, which bear in mind is more than a decade after the expedition started, Captain Crozier alongside another unnamed crew member were seen in the Baker Lake area, hundreds of miles south of where they'd started marching. A cairn found in the area built using British methods and natives confirming the identity of Crozier through photographs indicate that it's pretty likely he actually made it that far. While he still would have been hundreds of miles from the nearest Western establishment, part of me wonders just a little bit if he actually survived somehow. Maybe he took up with the Inuit, maybe he just lived out in the wilderness. I mean, it's a pretty silly thought, I'm sure, but there's just that little part of me that really wants to believe that. He declined command out of humility or perhaps out of being discriminated against for being Irish, yet for most of the expedition he was the man in charge. He tried to lead his men to safety and was one of the last ones left alive, potentially living for up to 12 years after the disappearance. To be as unshakable as that is almost beyond belief. Also, real quick, I just want to acknowledge Wendigoon's excellent video on this topic, and relative to that detail in particular. He says that's his favorite detail, and it's mine as well, and really, how can't it be? History is at its most fascinating when somebody stands in complete defiance of the odds, surviving where no other person could. Even if he eventually died out there, making it that far and surviving that long is nothing short of superhuman. I also love another idea Wendigoon mentioned. If Crozier really did make it that far, then he and whoever was still with him might have seen the real entrance to the Northwest Passage they'd suffered, bled, and starved for. It may not have been much in the face of such overwhelming struggle, but that at least might have been something of a victory. That brings us to part 5, Aftermath and Discovery. In the end, the British Admiralty decided that it was just not worth trying to pursue the Northwest Passage anymore. The conditions were too treacherous, and too many good men had died. I mean, if well-trained explorers can't survive it, then how the hell do you expect normal merchant ships to do it? However, in all the attempts to find the lost men, much of the region ended up getting mapped out anyway, to the point that some have said that more knowledge was gained from the expedition's failure than would have been by its success. though I wouldn't exactly say it was worth it. At least all that was poured into trying to save those men came to something. It's at this point we'll address the skeleton in the closet, which is maybe a little too on the nose of this story, before we move on to how, recently, the 2 lost ships got found. When it comes to addressing the cannibalism, I think I'll approach it this way. It's obviously horrible, it's beyond unthinkable, but it is worth considering how horrible and beyond unthinkable the situation itself was. But the truth is that it happened in all likelihood. A study published in the International Journal of Osteoarchaeology in 2015 found significant evidence of cannibalism, including evidence that human bones had been intentionally broken and pot polished, which is something that only occurs in situations so desperate that those doing the eating literally extract marrow from bone in the attempt to survive. While I do think it's really easy to judge the crew members for this from our comfortable houses with food in the fridge, it's really hard to say what any of us would do in such a desperate situation. At a certain point, they were completely without food or any way to get more, and the drive to survive is really very strong. I suppose at the end of the day, it's up to you to decide if that's too far or a bridge never to cross, but I mean, really, I just hope I never end up in that kind of situation where cannibalism is even a potential option in the first place. Now we can move on to the discoveries themselves. In the years following the disappearance, a lot of evidence of the expedition's crew were found, but not the lost ships themselves. In all likelihood, the ice they were trapped in eventually breached their hulls, causing them to sink into the frigid waters. The people of the time weren't exactly equipped to search in Arctic oceans for shipwrecks, and so they remained lost for a very, very long time. So long, in fact, that it wasn't until 2014 when a Canadian search group got the initiative and the funding to go on the hunt for the Erebus and the Terror again, and hopefully locate the lost ships as a way to help solve the mystery of Franklin's lost expedition. As a part of what was called the Victoria Strait expedition, they first recovered a series of artifacts indicating that they might have been in the right area before on the 9th of September 2014 announcing that they had located one of the lost ships. As time went on, they were able to move to more thoroughly excavate the sites, which are actually now protected by the Canadian government and even joint-owned with the Inuit people. The first wreck they found was confirmed to be the Erebus, though in 2018, Parks Canada announced the wreck had been damaged, and they weren't able to investigate thoroughly due to harsh conditions. The Terror would be found in 2016, and apparently it hadn't been left at anchor when it had been abandoned. Given it was likely trapped in the ice, anchoring it may have been anywhere from unnecessary to physically impossible. Yet, of all this, what not everyone knows is one of the biggest contributing factors to the find: Inuit oral tradition and one Louis Kamukik, which I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. He was an explorer, a historian, a forensic archaeologist, and from what I can gather reading about him, an all-around pretty cool guy. If you don't know, the Inuits have a culture of oral tradition. Their people's history is passed down in the form of stories told from one generation to the next, and of all these, Lewis gravitated towards one in particular: the story of his great-grandmother coming upon a ridge and finding strange artifacts that turned out to be relics from Franklin's lost expedition. What Lewis did that is so incredible to think about is compile all of the dozens, if not hundreds of stories he'd heard from all the people in his community into writing, and from that point, he used those details spoken of to help deduce where the Erebus and the Terror might have been. And the crazy thing is, his guesses were pretty much spot on, and a big help in actually finding where the Erebus and the Terror were. According to John Geiger, a friend of his and the chief executive officer of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, Louis played a critical role in the successes we have seen in the last 5 years with the discovery of both Franklin's lost vessels. He went on to say, "I refer to Louis as the last great Franklin searcher. He was devoted to his search for decades, and he made enormous contributions to it, not just in refining modern searchers' thinking, but also in terms of how he interacted with the young people in Gioa Haven and other communities in the Arctic, where he was able to underscore for them the importance of their oral tradition." The story of Lewis has seemed to be overlooked in most of the places I've searched. In fact, I had no idea about it until I saw a comment under Wendigoon's video talking about him. And so I decided to dig into it myself, and I discovered this incredible story of a guy combining all the knowledge of his people on this subject into results the best of modern technology and methods just couldn't match. So I guess if this video has some sort of greater purpose, it's to make Louis Kamukak just a little bit more known about. Unfortunately, he passed away on March 22nd of 2018 as a result of cancer, but according to those who knew him, he remained dedicated, optimistic, and passionate to the very end. And considering how much he'd done alone, since Inuit oral tradition just wasn't taken serious at all until recently, I think admirable is a word that fits him very well. Part 6. Conclusion. So what do I think? Well, I mean, it doesn't really matter, I'm just some guy. But I've been fascinated by the story of the Erebus and the Terror ever since I watched the show, and making this video has been really quite a journey. I thought I knew basically everything about this topic. You know, I'd watched all the YouTube videos, I'd seen some of the documentaries, the whole 9 yards. I learned a lot. The weirdest, which I haven't mentioned till now because I don't know where else I was going to put it, is that I mentioned the band Ailstorm in the last video, and it actually turns out they have a song called Magnetic North that's about Franklin's Lost Expedition, which, you know, I also talked about Franklin's Lost Expedition last video, so that's just kind of a weird coincidence. But more importantly, however, I found out about maybe the disaster not being the result of lead poisoning. Maybe Crozier saw the Northwest Passage, and I found out about Louis Kamukik, and I don't know, making this video has become a pretty enlightening experience for me, and hopefully for you too. I know this is a long video for me and my editor, and it's very different from everything else I've posted, but I maintain that the best way to learn how to write and tell stories is to learn about those real stories that have come before you in history. A wise woman once said to me, "Writers have the hardest job in the world as they have to know everything." And I think this is a really interesting and really important part of that everything, and I hope you think so too. So thank you so much for watching, and it'd mean the world if you chose to like and subscribe. We might hit 1,000 subscribers soon, and that's a milestone I've been looking forward to since I had a crappy channel as a kid long before this one. Anyway, that's enough rambling from me. What can I take from this? What can my and remember statement be? I guess we'll go with what I learned, and I will try to remember myself. All stories, even those you know best, have another perspective you may never have heard about. Seek it out.